Thank you very much for those words, and I want to thank all of you very much, especially those of you who have come to more lectures than this particular one, because I know that everyone is very busy, particularly the faculty who teach courses regularly each day, and so to attend these lectures is an additional burden, I think. And consequently, I want you to know that I'm very appreciative of your having done so, and all the rest of you who have hung in with this series. Many, many thanks. As we have seen in the past evenings, traditional African culture had produced very complex understandings of the spiritual realm, of tribal community, family life, and their interrelatedness. Accordingly, we have argued that those traditional African cosmologies formed the substrata for their later appropriation of the Christian gospel. Thus, contrary to the intent of Christian missionaries, traditional African thought was not replaced by Christianity, but rather was expanded and deepened by it. In fact, the gradual enculturation of Christianity into African culture produced a reciprocal effect whereby each was enriched by the other in certain respects. For example, while affirming the many virtues of tribal community, Christianity opposed tribalism by advocating the expansion of community to include the whole of humanity. Similarly, while affirming the protective care of the divinities and ancestral spirits, Christianity introduced the idea of God's capacity to render assistance independent of human initiative, whether that initiative be through ritualistic practices or sacrificial offerings. In turn, traditional African culture contributed to Christianity two of its primary values. One, an understanding of the cosmos in general and human life in particular as thoroughly sacred. And two, a deep sense of harmony within and among the spiritual, historical, and natural realms of existence. Now I would like to focus our attention on the place of the individual person in traditional African thought. First and foremost, we cannot overemphasize the fact that in traditional African life, the individual person has no meaningful existence apart from the community, which includes both contemporaries and predecessors. Unlike Western understandings of humanity, traditional African culture had no comprehension of human nature as a generalized essence. That is, we will often talk about human nature as such. And I'm saying that that kind of essence they have had no comprehension of. Rather, the value of human beings was always located in certain attributes attending the particularity of persons, attributes that were recognizable by the community. Perhaps the premier attribute is contained in a person's name, which always specifies the circumstances surrounding birth and some important dimensions of the person's destiny. And so if one knows the particular language, then when the person gives their name, they have already communicated all of that to you, because the names are filled with meaning, unlike our names that are just sort of pleasant sounding words and they don't necessarily have any meanings. Perhaps thus the value of persons was measured in part by their specific roles and contributions to the life of the community. Accordingly, the community responded reciprocally through its gifts of recognition, which were appropriately concretized in the naming ceremony. For example, the eldest son always inherited a place of primacy among his siblings, and similarly, the eldest daughter enjoyed special status, though not exactly equal to that of the eldest son. Although the principle of age has always been a permanent measure of value in the order of sibling relations, it has not been the only such standard. Rather, the person's destiny may either increase or decrease his or her value in both the family and the larger community. Thus, immediately following the birth of a baby, great importance attends the act of discerning the nature of the child's destiny. In fact, the child cannot be named until such determination is made, since the name itself bears the child's destiny. More importantly, the child's destiny is the child's spiritual nature, since the child received it from the Supreme God immediately before birth. Destiny is universal in the sense that every African has one, yet its content is always peculiarly specific. In fact, it constitutes a person's true personality, which will continue manifesting itself throughout the person's lifetime. It is what Professor Awolalu calls the personality soul, with a hyphen in between. He says, according to the oral traditions, the personality soul derives directly from the Supreme Being. It is this personality soul that really makes a person whatever he is. It accounts for the peculiar characteristics of the individual. Indeed, it is the ruler of the individual. It serves as his double or guardian angel, who is associated with him from birth to warn and help him through this life and guide his fortunes. End of quote. Africans believe that the specific content of this personality soul comprises one's destiny. That is to say, before coming into the world, the Supreme Being attaches one's destiny to one's personality soul, and the passage of life is a process of actualizing that destiny. Professor Awolalu admits that this belief has much in common with the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. Traditionally, Africans have believed that the destiny humans receive from God is both permanent and unalterable. Yet many also believe the contrary, namely that destiny can be modified in some ways by the quality of one's character. That is to say, a good destiny must be supported by good moral character, or otherwise the divinities will have their revenge by replacing the good destiny with a bad one. And similarly, bad character or the ill will of witches, sorcerers, and other evil spirits can cause a happy destiny to deteriorate. Thus, humans must regularly seek the help of the oracle Divinity, who has the capacity to help preserve good destinies and rectify unhappy ones. Through such assistance, persons can learn what to do and what to avoid. Accordingly, cultic devotion to the oracle Divinity is widespread throughout Africa, so that happy destinies might be preserved and unhappy ones rectified. Yet we must not fail to notice that from the African's point of view, the influence of moral character on one's destiny clearly reveals that a strong belief in predestination need not nullify personal responsibility for moral development. Rather, Professor Idowu writes, with the element of character involved, a person is not allowed to expect an automatic fulfillment of a good destiny. He must cooperate to make his destiny successful by acquiring and practicing good character. Since the person is an integral part of the community assumes major responsibility for the person's moral and spiritual development. As a result, the individual person is never alone, but continuously advised, prodded, encouraged by family members and others. Each significant event in the person's life is at one and the same time a significant event in the life of the community, since the community is affected for good or for ill by the unfolding drama of the individual's life. And Beatty has described this reality accordingly. Let me read this. What then is the individual, and where is his place in the community? In traditional life, the individual does not and cannot exist alone except corporately. He owes his existence to other people, including those of past generations. He is simply part of the whole. The community must therefore make, create, or produce the individual. Physical birth is not enough. The child must go through rites of incorporation so that it becomes fully integrated into the entire society. These rites continue throughout the physical life of the person, during which the individual passes from one stage of corporate existence to another. The final stage is reached when he dies, and even then he is ritually incorporated into the wider family of both the dead and the living. To go on, this is a bit lengthy, I know, but let me go on with this quote. Only in terms of other people does the individual become conscious of his own being, his own duties, his privileges and responsibilities towards himself and towards other people. When he suffers, he does not suffer alone, but with the corporate group. When he rejoices not alone, but with his kinsmen, his neighbors and his relatives, whether dead or living. When he gets married, he is not alone, neither does the wife belong to him alone. So also the children belong to the corporate body of the kinsmen, even if they bear only their father's name. Whatever happens to the individual happens to the whole group. And whatever happens to the whole group happens to the individual. The individual can only say, I am because we are. Well, that's a long quote. Let me just clarify one thing there. When I said that even the wife belongs to the community, this does not mean that in terms of conjugal relations, but it means that people consider the wife to be not just the husband's wife, but the wife is within the entire family. That's what's being communicated there, and similarly with the husband. As I said last night, marriage isn't just a matter of two individual persons, but it's rather two families that have come together, and that the marriage is integrally tied up with that family in that family context. While African peoples view the individual person as a part of a whole, it is clear that they place high value on the life of all persons. Yet it is also clear that that high value, or that the highest good among African peoples, is not the individual person. Rather, in the order of moral importance, the corporate community is more important, always assumes priority over the part. And that's the reverse of the way it is in the Western world at this present time, I think. Thus, under certain conditions, the person may be sacrificed for the well-being of the corporate body in much the same way, I think, as a modern-day person might choose to undergo a surgical procedure. That is, because the part is valued, surgery, even of the little finger, is rarely a casual decision. Invariably, its justification lies in its purpose, namely contributing to the health of the whole. And so I am prepared to sacrifice this part of my hand, or even the hand itself, or maybe even the arm, for the benefit and the well-being of the whole. Similarly, the sacrifice of a person for the common good is always a very serious undertaking, because the sacrifice itself has high value. Warfare provides another analogy. Under such conditions in our country, courageous persons willingly risk their lives for the common good, and their deaths are honored as national sacrifices. And there have been times of conscription during war where certain able-bodied persons were forced by the nation to take up arms and to go forth to run the risk of sacrificing their lives. Now, similarly, in the African context, individual persons may well accrue considerable personal honor by virtue of their self-sacrifice. Serving the common good is the highest moral good. Consequently, Africans have no difficulty in understanding and honoring the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ for the good of the whole human race. Now, this is a little bit confusing, because when I'm talking about sacrifice and African sacrifice, I'm not talking about human sacrifice in the sense of, because that was a practice as well in the distant past, which has all but disappeared. But I'm talking about individual persons sacrificing other interests of self for the benefit of the whole, and often individual persons being deprived of various things because of the service necessary for the whole. Now, before being born, which I've mentioned before, a person receives his or her value from God in the form of destiny. In the days following birth, the primary responsibility of the family elders is to determine the meaning of the life that has emerged and to decide whether or not to incorporate it into the community. In traditional societies, not every birth was celebrated. At times, evil forces of various kinds were thought to have intercepted the process and, unless rectified, would bring evil consequences to the whole community. Thus, careful assessment of the issue was required during the early days of delivery, when the elders had satisfied themselves that the birth is a good one. The process of naming the child is the first act of incorporating the child into the community. And this is the process of bestowing personhood. The idea is that personhood has to be bestowed by the community. That act bestows, as I've said, personhood on the new life, which is tantamount to announcing its spiritual and moral worth in the community. This act manifests the community's blessing, since the life has been judged to be wholly good. Otherwise, it would not have been welcomed into the community, as was often the case with births that were judged to be misfortunes. In those circumstances, the life was not permitted to survive, and the evil force that intercepted it had to be exorcised through appropriate rituals. Virtually all African names have meaning. They describe the person's personality and tell the story of the significant circumstances surrounding the birth. The name constitutes the person. Its meaning evokes the person's admiration and encourages the person to aspire to live up to his or her name, to fully actualize its meaning in his or her character. I can remember being greatly surprised when sitting on a panel discussion at the University of Ibadan a half dozen years ago, and we were discussing the problems of young people in Nigeria. And there was a very wise chief on the panel. And when it came to his time to speak, he said that the problem, why the children were going astray and doing all of these terrible things these days, was because the parents had made mistakes in naming them. And therefore, they were not living up to the right names. And if they had been properly named, if their destiny had been properly understood, then they would be better off, and we wouldn't have these problems. And I was, quite surprised, but he dwelt on that in a very convincing way. His point is, what do the children have to live up to? If it's not their name. The communal evaluative process that begins at birth continues throughout life, since the community has more than a casual interest in the destiny of all its members, since the destiny of each person affects the well-being of the whole community, for better or for worse. Thus, nothing is taken more seriously by African communities than the nurture and guidance of individual persons, who in fact belong to the community. Hence, the community is teacher, parent, guardian, advocate, legislator of all. And Beatty says, in African societies, the birth of a child is a process which begins long before the child's arrival in this world and continues long thereafter. It is not just a single event which can be recorded on a particular date. Nature brings the child into the world, but society creates the child into a social being, a corporate person. For it is the community which must protect the child, feed it, bring it up, educate it, and in many other ways incorporate it into the wider community. Children are the buds of society, and every birth is the arrival of spring, when life shoots out and the community thrives. The birth of a child is therefore the concern not only of the parents, but of many relatives, including the living and the departed. You see that there's values and principles and norms in such an understanding that would guide social policy in communities and in states if it were really taken seriously. And in terms of these values and this responsibility of the community being structured in such a way that, that all individual persons would be so nurtured and protected. Thus, African societies characteristically rejoice when a woman becomes pregnant. In some contexts, the marriage is not considered to be consummated until pregnancy occurs. And Beatty says that alone, that alone, that is pregnancy alone, marks the woman's complete integration into the husband's family. No greater tragedy befalls a woman than infertility. The childless woman not only has nobody of her own blood to maintain her immortality after death, but she fails to be a vehicle in the cyclical process of life by which the unborn enters the community's life, destined to enhance the community's quality. In the birth of a child, the whole community is born anew. It is renewed. It is revived and revitalized. The child is, in fact, owned by the community, which provides structures for guiding and monitoring its moral and social development. Many of these structures are in the form of rites of passage, which normally include the following: initiation and puberty rites, marriage and procreation, public titles and office, death, and access to the ancestral world. All of these are occasioned by great community celebrative events. All of these are sacred events confirmed by traditional ceremonies in which individual persons covenant with the community to be faithful in exercising all their respective duties and responsibilities. Some say that the individual person becomes fully born only after having passed through all of these rites of passage. In other words, being fully born is to be fully actualized, which can only occur in community. And thus, total alienation from the community is tantamount to losing one's personhood, and thus to be transformed into a mere thing. Traditional African culture valued tribal community more highly than the family, and similarly, it valued the family more highly than the individual person. The reason for such ranking is rooted in the necessary dependency of persons on the family and of the family on the larger community. In fact, apart from the family, the person would not emerge as a person. Personhood is a status that is bestowed upon one after birth and not a natural right by virtue of birth alone. Similarly, the African family has no meaningful reality apart from the tribal community. And in each case, the part-whole relationship is the appropriate analogy. That is to say, the one is related to the other in a reciprocal relation of interdependence, wherein each contributes to the well-being of the other. Yet it is self-evident to all that in the temporal order, the whole both precedes and supersedes the part. That is to say, the tribal community has priority over the family and the family over the individual, not unlike the relationship of any living organism to its biological parts. While the whole can survive a loss of the part can never survive apart from the whole. Thus, Africans contend that individual value, that is the value of the individual, is derivative from the community and measured by his or her contribution to the community's well-being. Community is the telos, the purpose and aim of moral value. Thus, individual rights and liberties are always determined within that context. This type of thinking is difficult for the Western mind to appreciate because the Western mind reverses the relation and bestows higher value on the individual person than on either the family or the larger community. Although there are numerous exceptions to the rule, the most obvious being that of military conscription, much of Western society has tended to view the sanctity of the individual person as the highest moral good. That is to say, the person is viewed as inviolable, and the preservation of its sanctity is held to be the highest moral principle. Accordingly, both the American Bill of Rights and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights are derivative from that principle of the individual being the highest good. Clearly, the Western justification of individual autonomy was long in the making, drawing its source material from the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the Enlightenment. To view those major philosophical and theological revolutions as supportive of individualism and inimical to corporate authority would be a gross oversimplification. Rather, I intend only to say that one finds in those movements radical new thinking about the importance of personal decision and responsibility, the value of individual liberty and conscience, and the many and varied shortcomings of external authorities. Although each movement made positive contributions towards developing normative understandings of community, their novel ideas centered on the relationship of the individual person to external authority, and more specifically, which of the two should have primacy, external authority or the individual person. Leaders in these movements were not the first to think seriously about this relationship, but they were the first to argue for the primacy of the individual over traditional authorities. Hence, in some respects, the principal founders of these movements unwittingly became the progenitors of Western individualism, and the modern Western world has become heirs of a tradition that is greatly suspicious of all external authority, and hence has had great difficulty in recreating the moral value of community. Western philosophy and theology, whether liberal or libertarian, romantic or existentialist, deontological or teleological, are replete with thought that elevates the importance of the individual over the community. Although this tradition has been a corrective over all societal systems that diminish the value of persons, it in turn needs a corrective from those who understand that the person lives as person only in genuine community. Now, it must be noted that as a value, individualism has led to and been supported by libertarian philosophies of various kinds, as well as numerous societal structures and public policies governed by the principle of laissez-faire. Those Western societies that radicalize the principle of individual autonomy invariably view all communal authorities as restraining forces fundamentally harmful to individual autonomy. It is well known to all that in all matters of faith and morals, the free church tradition of Protestantism has emphasized the primacy of the individual over the corporate community. This has implied the primacy of individual conscience in moral matters and of personal decision in matters of faith. The result has been that of relegating both morality and faith to the private sphere of life, thus leaving the public realm void of both religion and morality. And so, in the United States, for instance, the recent confirmation process for the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, one saw Judge Thomas justifying or saying in his confirmation hearing that his personal moral beliefs are irrelevant to his function as a judge, because a judge must be morally neutral. That is, allowing no preconceived views to influence his or her judicial judgment. In other words, the judge is saying that individual moral commitments have no role to play in judicial adjudication. And nobody batted an eye at that. None of the senators raised any questions pertaining to that, because I think if they had been in the same position, they would all agree that, of course, morality is a personal and subjective thing that you've got to keep out of the picture in relationship to such public matters. Well, I'm saying that the Western world has inherited that whole tradition that leads to and has led to the viewing morality and religion as subjective emotions and not appropriate for the public realm. Now, such thinking has had no place in traditional African society. Such thinking does take place, however, in those contemporary African societies concerned about the need to construct a modern secular state, which is a very difficult goal to accomplish when the architects of such a design are persons who are greatly influenced by the holism of traditional culture. That is, people who know no distinction between the sacred and the secular have a very great problem in designing a secular state. And to design a modern state, the model for a modern state is that it ought to be a secular state. Now, not all states, not all modern states are secular states. Particularly the Muslim states can never be secular states. And so they themselves never set themselves to that task. But one of the reasons why in African contexts they feel it necessary to do this is because they have traditional African religion functioning alongside of Christianity, and both of those functioning alongside of Islam, and all of these in the same country. And so how do you then constitute a state where the sacred and there's no sacred secular split in a situation where you have at least three major religious traditions? And so then they feel that it's necessary to have a secular state. Well, nobody knows how to have a secular state. And I think that this may be one of the reasons why the vast majority of African countries have been, for the past 2 decades or more, since independence, under military rule, because they haven't been able to find a constitutional process that works for their own countries. Although Western individualism has had its effect on Africans in the diaspora, the latter have rarely become exemplars of that line of thought. And certainly, virtually none argue for the separation of morality from the public realm. For 3 centuries, Africans in the diaspora have struggled for freedom from slavery, and thereafter they have worked tirelessly for a racially just society, both of which they see as being integrally moral goals. Since freedom and justice are basic moral principles, African peoples have longed for a new moral order in their respective countries. That is, a new community in which individuals and the race as a whole might flourish. These have known beyond a doubt that persons cannot thrive apart from community, and that a community that oppresses them is almost worse than no community at all. These have never been able to discern any moral justification for either religious or moral systems that uphold societal structures whose purposes are to benefit one group of people while depriving another. Contrary to the opinions of some, these contend that morality attends everything humans do, and they insist that it is erroneous to think of societal structures and or their leaders as morally neutral in the exercise of any of their functions. Rather, they hold that moral value attends all human action. And if that be the case, then it is appropriate to subject the moral quality of our public action to ethical criticism in order to critically analyze its foundational principles and hopefully to bring about the necessary changes. In all of this, African peoples in the diaspora have continuously enriched the public discourse by keeping the moral issues of racial justice on the public agenda. I think that the greatest exemplar of that in the 20th century in North America was Martin Luther King Jr. I would also say, and frequently feel it's necessary to say to churches and organizations interested in the public well-being, that they do the public a great service by keeping important moral issues on the public agenda. Now, often, unfortunately, many organizations are involved in keeping trivial moral issues on the public agenda. I underline important moral issues on the public agenda. Now, of course, one might say, well, my understanding of importance is not the same as somebody else's, but I think we could discuss that. Finally, in their struggle for freedom and justice, Africans in the diaspora have concentrated their energies on the need to construct a better public world, rather than the need to protect the private realm of human existence. Consequently, they have been moved primarily by a longing for the restoration of community, rather than the desire for the protection of individual rights and liberties. Thus, they have worked unceasingly for the communal goal of racial justice, which has often implied direct conflicts with the philosophies and laws supporting and protecting private property rights. Because in many ways, the focus on individualism is at its roots a focus on the protection of private property. After all, slavery itself was an issue of private property rights, as was also the various forms of racial discrimination. Thus, these racial justice advocates have often found themselves in opposition to some of the basic philosophies operative in the Western world, philosophies underlying the French and American revolutions that sought to liberate the individual from the heteronymous control of law and tradition in their emphasis on the natural rights and liberties of individual persons on the political, economic, and social levels of life. In short, the political philosophy of libertarianism inevitably worked against racial justice by relegating the issue and its resolution to the private realm. For these reasons, blocks in the United States and in Canada have tended to support those political parties that more readily assume that the government should play an active role in ensuring the necessary political and economic conditions for the common good. Laissez-faire philosophies have never served the needs of Africans in the diaspora. And so, like their African forebears, the interest is primarily for community and its restoration, and secondarily for the individual persons, because the assumption is that if the community is well-founded, then the rights and of individuals will be protected. Thank you very much for being so attentive.